Chapter 17 The Crabs. Next morning the sun shone brightly with that clear, warmth-giving light of the Cape York Peninsula mornings, pools of water glistening in every depression in the rocks. The leg was dreadfully stiff. I crept down into the den, fearful lest the banked-up fire might have smothered itself. But the ashes were comfortingly warm. Tearing up a strip of bark and crushing it into fiber was the work of a moment. Similarly, to scrape away the ashes, place the fiber in the hot middle, bend down, and blow. Tiny sparks flew up among the ashes. Soon the fiber blazed, and presently a crackling fire warmed the den. It was a cheery triumph. Already I felt better. The company of fire to a lonely man is wonderful, especially when he is sick. There was plenty of fresh water. The fire was here. Everything was quite all right. Suddenly I thought of the fish spear. The precious iron prongs had been carried away by the impaled fish yesterday. That memory was a jolt from the Iron Age back to the wood at one blow. Still the fire crackled companionably. Wooden spear prongs, just as the aboriginals fashioned them, must replace iron for the time being. Hopeless, though, to walk through the mangroves to find and spear fish until the leg got better. A few days at least. Crabs and shellfish, impossible to starve. The world was a cheery place again. It could have been much worse. Now for the job of crawling up the crevice and limping back with a billy can of water. To bathe the wound was the main thing now. That wash in fresh salt water yesterday had stung it cruelly, but a salted wound was better than a poisoned leg. Soon the billy boiled, and a long bathing of the wound brought considerable relief. Whistling, I hobbled to the patch of scrub and carefully selected a slender but strong stick 8 feet long, then a much thinner one. From these would be fashioned a spear. As I threw them down the crevice and went for a billy can of water, dismay came. The few rock pools already showed signs of evaporation. This meant painstaking labor in sheltering the precious holes with flat rocks. The handful of little local birds were amusingly indignant, for they had claimed the water to bathe in. But they could fly to the well. I told them so when they scolded me. After a searching gaze across the sunlit sea, I crawled down into the den, poked the spear sticks into the ashes of the fire, and stretched back to rest the leg. I fell asleep to awake and see stars glinting like softest gold down through the black rock crevice, and hunger came. Then began work that grew more interesting as the night wore on, the fire humming cheery encouragement. Blessing the precious pocket-knife, I cut the smaller stick into 4 18-inch lengths, carefully making the points long and tapering, but not too thin, for a long thin point snaps off easily, becomes bird with one throw, should it miss the fish and hit coral or root. After the sharpening, the prongs were thrust into hot ashes, with the butts just protruding so that each could be continually turned. Then began the paring down of the long haft of the spear to be, the wood being shaved and scraped so that the balance of weight would start at about 18 inches from the spearhead. The prongs, when eventually bound to the spear head, would project another 12 inches, thus the haft weight, being nearly 2 feet behind the prong tips, would lend balance and accuracy, and give distance with weight to the spear throw. What a fix would a man have been in had he not keenly watched the aboriginal spear makers at work. Those beetle-browed old experts had a lifetime of practice and unlimited leisure, for the young warriors of the tribe eagerly brought them food, in part payment for those perfectly made weapons. But I was a civilized man, and would be hungry on the morrow. For countless generations their ancestors had been trained to make out of wood weapons that would kill animals. A modern man was not even in the kindergarten class. they would have laughed uproariously at this attempt. I balanced the haft again and again, paring away a little here, a little there. It presently began to take shape, continuously turning the prongs in the ashes, heaping hotter ashes around them. I wondered the while how long it took the first aboriginals to discover the wood most suitable for their spears, the many differences and qualities of soft, medium, and hard woods, to learn the laws of length, straightness, weight, and balance, to learn that heat properly applied will straighten and toughen wood, make infinitely better weapons. How long did it take them to evolve their different spears, fish and animal in war? How much longer then to learn that a bone or stone point was superior in cutting and lasting qualities to wood? And who at long last was the genius who thought out and made the Woomera, that lever which lends a spear so much greater accuracy, distance, and striking power than when thrown by hand? Only when a man sits down to make a Stone Age weapon does he realize the thought and craftsmanship that through centuries must have gone into the production of these weapons. When the haft was shaped, I spread out ashes and buried it in them, continually turning it all through the night, heaping hotter ashes here and there in constant endeavor to straighten and toughen it. To harden it, especially the prongs, requires a long and slow process that time would not allow, nor was the wood suitable. A shaft of light creeping down the crevice surprisingly heralded the coming of a new dawn. The night had flown, indeed. The fire was burning soberly. A receding murmur from the reef told that the tide was racing out to sea. I bound the 4 prongs to the haft tip, using a torn strip from the blanket, and fixing each prong so that the 4 tips were spread just 2 inches from each other. Thus the aboriginals thousands of years ago anticipated one great difference before our shotgun and rifle. A rifle carries much farther than a shotgun, propelling one straight bullet that must hit to kill. The shotgun carries only a short distance, but its many pellets spread out, lending a much greater chance of hitting the object with some, at least, of the pellets. So, with the aboriginals' war and hunting and fish spears, the war spear can be thrown farther, but its one point must hit the object. The fish spear, with its 4 prongs, will not travel nearly so far, but the spread of its 4 prongs gives it 4 chances, though only one of those prongs is needed to pierce a fish. These prongs of mine were none too hard, but they must serve for the time being. I crawled up the crevice, eager to try this weapon fashioned by my own hand. In gold and flame the sun had already sprung up over the sea. By a distant sandbank several toy handkerchiefs were revealed by the growing light. Bessemer cutters already at work out towards the Great Barrier Reef. If only lack of water would bring them to the island, if they only knew water was here. It was useless wishing. They would sail to the mainland for water, knowing well the difficulty of landing on this island except in calm weather. Sea roamers, all of them, here today, gone tomorrow. My leg being a bit sore and stiff, I used a forked stick as a crutch to hobble down to the reef. After a while the leg grew warm and much easier. A good meal would work wonders. Some rocks at the sea edge were encrusted with small oysters, inviting a man to crush many shells with a stone, but this scanty repast was barely an appetizer. Numerous spiky shellfish, fleshed in vivid red and green, lay in shallow pools. A dubious-looking meal these, but it might be advisable to lay some on the rocks and later to cook and try them. A future serious accident or illness might nail me to the mounds beyond hope of seeking fish or crabs. Should such disaster come, edible shellfish within a few yards of the mound might be precious. The urge to live in primitive environment makes a man think ahead. Had I only known it, there is plenty of edible shellfish out on the reef. The mussels of the big clams, even though tough, are quite eatable, despite the poisonous-looking fringe. It was 1,000 yards walk along the reef to the foot of the peak where the crab colony lived in its gloomy corner of the mangrove edge. That ledge of dead coral just within the mangrove edge was really their battlements, and within that wall they had their burrows. A beautiful day, the grass golden on the sides of the peak, the flagpole stood up there outlined, sharp as a needle, its flag of distress bravely flapping in a light breeze. Big clams showered their water sprays as I hobbled along. Little crabs scuttled into pools in which were big black bêche de mer, like crinkly gnomes, among fairy gardens of seaweeds and coral. Along the edge of the reef a blackfin moved effortlessly. Oh, for a rifle to smash the beastly thing! It kept exact pace with me along the edge of the reef, neither gliding 1 yard ahead nor falling 1 yard behind. I crouched low when near the crab colony, for those horny-plated fellows would scamper towards the burrows the moment they saw danger. Not right into their burrows, but near enough for a quick bolt to safety. There they would watch, edging inch by inch near their burrows as I approached foot by foot. Those crabs knew me. Peering from the butt of the mangrove tree, I surveyed my prospective breakfast. Half a dozen big green fellows were down at the water's edge, industriously hunting for their breakfast, while other big blue fellows were straddling across the coral between the water and the burrows. Still others were foraging among the mangrove roots for small shellfish in the mud. One with his enormous claws was crushing a shell. Several were half in and half out of their burrows, leisurely regarding the scenery. Two big fellows commenced to quarrel, circling round each other with claws menacingly open and stretched out over their heads, grotesquely suggestive of crouching wrestlers. One reached out swiftly, but the other slid aside, jerking his claws well back as a boxer might leap aside with raised arms to ward off a blow. The coral pebbles rattled from their slithering legs and shells as each sought to grip the other's claw, keeping their softer bellies to the ground while presenting to the other the tough shell of their backs. Suddenly one sprang, rearing swiftly as he tried to heave his claws over the back of the other. But this fellow reared too, and they clashed ineffectively, reeling apart, crouching again. Other crabs were watching, several warily edging closer as if anxious to join in. With a spring of fighters clenched, hard shell rattling on shell, claws clashing with the vicious snap of steel traps. One claw was shorn straight off at a joint. It rattled on the coral, while the wounded crab fought desperately with the remaining claw to regain its burrow. The other fiercely pressed his advantage, warding off attack with one claw while snapping for a grip to crush his adversary's head with the other. As I sprang forward, they reared up, fighting a stallion's might, striving to tear each other to pieces. One swift thrust, and the spear prongs had impaled both crabs. There was a scraping rattle of hard shells on coral as the onlookers vanished. I was thrilled with the spear, then immediately saw that the prongs had penetrated the tender underparts of the crabs when they had reared up. Still, so much for the better, for if the prongs had penetrated the upper hard shells, the points would have been burred. The walk back to the mound was a pleasure, and I remembered to collect the shellfish on the way. The billy was soon boiled, the crabs cooked and hungrily eaten, while the shellfish were cooking. It really would be wise to eat several and learn if they were good for food. The possibility of becoming ill and incapable of moving far from the mound for food had taken a strong hold, but the eating of those fish later in the afternoon brought on violent sickness. That evening, partially recovered from fright and sickness, I sat up on the mound looking across at Coquet. The cheery little light would flash a moment, then vanish, to flash again just when expected. It seemed to come round and flash just for me, great company.